Steven Seagal had spent the last few years living a life most people would call peaceful, but for him, it was simply quiet. Too quiet. After decades of classified missions, covert operations, and life-or-death decisions, he chose a remote countryside town to disappear from the noise of the world. No one here knew who he really was. No one knew that beneath his calm presence lived one of the deadliest Delta Force commanders ever trained. And Steven liked it that way. Every morning, he took a slow walk around his cabin, always accompanied by his closest companion, a large black dog named Shadow. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was family. Steven had rescued him years ago during one of his final operations overseas. Since then, Shadow never left his side. The bond between them was forged in danger, loyalty, and trust. On this particular evening, the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in deep orange. Steven sat on his porch, sipping tea, watching Shadow chase leaves across the yard. It was the kind of serenity he wished could last forever. But peace is always temporary, especially for a man with his past. A pair of police cruisers rolled slowly up the gravel road. Steven didn't pay much attention. The local cops often patrolled the area. But tonight, these weren't the regular officers. These were the newly transferred, aggressive unit, known around town for abusing their authority. People whispered about them, but no one ever dared challenge them. Shadow, curious as ever, jogged toward the road, tail wagging. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, annoyed, tense, as if looking for trouble. One of them placed a hand on his weapon the moment he saw the dog. Steven sensed something was off. He stood up from his chair, a subtle shift in his energy. His instincts honed through decades of combat, began to whisper warnings. Shadow barked once, not aggressively, but playfully. The officer flinched. "Get that dog away from me," he snapped. Before Steven could call Shadow back, before he could take a single step, a single gunshot shattered the quiet evening. Shadow collapsed on the dirt road. Steven froze. His breath stopped. His world narrowed to a single point of pain. The officers had no idea what they had just done, but they were about to learn who they had crossed. For a moment, Steven Seagal couldn't move. His entire world shrank into that single gunshot still echoing through the trees. The officer lowered his weapon casually, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just taken the life of Steven's only companion. Shadow lay motionless on the ground. Dust settled around his body, carried by the cold evening breeze. Steven felt something inside him shift, not rage, not panic, something far colder. A silence settled over him, the kind that comes before a storm. He walked toward Shadow, each step slow, deliberate. The officers watched him with irritation, not fear. They didn't know him. They didn't know what kind of man walked toward them with eyes that had once stared down enemy soldiers, warlords, and terrorists. "Sir, step back," one officer barked. Steven didn't respond. He knelt beside Shadow, placing a trembling hand on the dog's fur. Shadow's body was still warm. The loyalty, the years of companionship, the memories, gone in an instant because of a trigger-happy officer. The lead cop shrugged. "It's just a dog. Should have kept it on a leash. Just a dog." Those words hit harder than the bullet. Steven slowly rose to his feet. His expression didn't change. His voice didn't rise, but the air around him seemed to tighten. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. The officer scoffed. "Calm down, old man." "Old man." Another mistake. Steven took one step toward them. Instantly, the second officer placed a hand on Steven's chest, pushing him back roughly. "Back off," he snapped, "or we'll arrest you for interfering." Steven didn't react. He didn't raise his hands. Didn't argue. He just stared. A stare that felt like it could cut through steel. A stare these officers had never seen before. A stare men far more dangerous than them had learned to fear. "Look," the lead officer said, waving his hands dismissively. "Your mutt got too close. We acted according to protocol." End of discussion. Protocol. Steven tilted his head slightly. Protocol doesn't involve shooting an unarmed animal. The officer stepped closer, face inches from Steven's. "What are you? Some kind of expert?" Steven inhaled slowly. "Something like that." But before he could say more, a small group of neighbors gathered nearby, drawn by the gunshot. Cameras lifted. People whispered. The officers suddenly grew uneasy. The attention was making them nervous. One neighbor shouted, "Why'd you shoot his dog? He didn't do anything." The officers ignored them and turned back to Steven. "Walk away," the lead cop ordered, jabbing a finger into Steven's chest. "Before you make things worse for yourself." Steven didn't blink. A lifetime of discipline kept his anger buried beneath an icy calm. But inside him, the warrior, the one the world had forgotten, was awakening. "I'm not going anywhere," Steven said softly. "Not until justice is served." The officers exchanged irritated glances. They still weren't taking him seriously. They thought he was just another quiet old man grieving a lost pet. They had no idea they had just crossed a man trained by the most elite special forces on Earth. They had no idea whom they were threatening. They had no idea the storm they had unleashed. Have you ever lost a pet you loved? Comment below and tell me which country or city you're watching this story from. The officers stood in front of Steven Seagal, annoyed but still confident. They had guns. They had badges. They had authority. What they didn't have was awareness. Awareness of the man standing silently before them. Awareness of the past he carried. Awareness of what he was capable of. As the crowd grew larger, someone whispered loudly, "Is that Steven Seagal?" The actor, a teenager, shook his head. "Nah, he's too old. Plus, why would he be here?" Steven ignored the murmurs. He kept his gaze locked on the officers. His hand rested gently on Shadow's fur, as if silently promising him something. Justice, peace, revenge, maybe all three. The lead officer grew impatient. "Sir, this situation is over. You can file a complaint later." Steven looked up slowly. "You're wrong. It's not over." The officer exhaled sharply. "Look, we don't want trouble." Steven stood up fully, and for the first time, there was a visible shift in the air around him. His posture was relaxed but powerful, the kind of stance that only comes from years of disciplined combat training. "You already have trouble," he said. "You just haven't realized it yet." The second officer stepped forward. A young guy, maybe mid-20s, full of ego and arrogance. "You take one more step," he warned, "and I'll." "You'll what?" Steven asked, his tone calm. "Shoot me the way you shot my dog." The crowd gasped. Phones recorded everything. The officers tensed up. The young cop reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around. You're under arrest for obstruction." But before he could grab Steven's arm, the old warrior moved. Not with speed, but with precision. Steven shifted his weight, deflecting the officer's arm gently, almost effortlessly. It wasn't aggressive, just controlled. The officer stumbled forward, confused by how easily he had been redirected. "What the? Don't touch me again," he barked. Steven raised both hands peacefully. "I don't want conflict, but I won't let you disrespect me or my companion." The lead cop stepped closer, trying to intimidate him. "I don't care who you are. Actor, martial artist, whatever. You follow the law like everyone else." Steven's voice lowered. "I know the law. Better than you." The officer smirked. "Yeah? Who are you?" "Some ex-military wannabe." The crowd stayed silent. Steven did not blink. "I served," he said quietly, "long before you were born. In places you've never heard of. With people whose names you're not cleared to know." The young officer snorted. "What, like Navy SEALs?" Steven's eyes narrowed. "Higher. Delta Force?" the officer joked. The crowd chuckled nervously. Steven's silence was answer enough. The laughter stopped. Even the officers froze for a second, processing what that meant. Delta Force wasn't just elite. It was the unit that handled missions no one ever knew about. Missions without records. Missions where failure was not an option. And Steven wasn't just a member. He was one of their best. But he didn't brag, didn't shout, didn't boast. He simply stood there, a quiet storm wrapped in discipline. The lead cop shook off the doubt and grabbed Steven's arm. "I'm done listening to this tough guy act." Steven didn't resist, at first. But when the officer twisted his arm aggressively, something inside the old warrior snapped. Not anger. Awakening. Steven shifted his foot half an inch, rotated his wrist, and suddenly the lead officer's grip collapsed. In one smooth motion, Steven redirected the man's momentum, stepping aside as the officer stumbled forward. The officer spun in shock. What the hell was that? Steven didn't answer, but the crowd did. "That's Aikido," someone shouted. "That's definitely Steven Seagal." Phones zoomed in. Cameras recorded every angle. The officers were losing control, and they knew it. "You think this is funny?" the young officer yelled, pulling out his baton. He swung. Steven didn't move until the last possible moment. Then, a slight shift. The baton sliced through empty air. In the same motion, Steven tapped the officer's wrist with 2 fingers. Just a touch, but placed at the perfect nerve point. The officer's hand went numb. The baton dropped. The crowd roared. But Steven wasn't showing off. He wasn't attacking. He was defending, calmly, proportionately, with mastery the officers couldn't even recognize. The lead officer stepped back, suddenly aware that he was standing in front of someone far more dangerous than he'd realized. You need to leave, he stuttered. Steven looked at him with a cold, heavy stare. I'm not leaving. My dog deserves justice. The officer raised his hands nervously. We can talk about that at the station. Steven shook his head. You had your chance to talk. Now you'll listen. The crowd grew completely silent. My dog wasn't just an animal, Steven said. He was trained, disciplined, loyal. He saved lives. And you ended his life without hesitation. The lead officer swallowed hard. Steven took one step closer. I spent decades serving this country, he continued. Saving people you'll never know. Fighting enemies you'll never see. And this is how you treat citizens. You think a badge gives you the right to do anything you want. The officer's voice cracked. We didn't know. That's the problem, Steven said. You never know. You never ask. You only act. The silence became heavy. The young officer whispered, What are you going to do to us? Steven looked at him with the calm of a man who had already chosen a path. That depends, he said softly. Are you ready to take responsibility for what you did? The officer stood frozen. The crowd waited. And the legend, the warrior, the man they should never have crossed, stood ready to decide their fate. The officers stood frozen, their confidence crumbling like sand beneath a wave. Steven Seagal didn't move, didn't threaten, didn't even raise his voice. Yet the pressure around him felt heavy enough to crush steel. The crowd, which had grown to nearly 30 people by now, watched in stunned silence. Everyone sensed the same thing. This man wasn't ordinary. This man wasn't to be provoked. This man carried a presence that demanded respect. But even then, not everyone had connected the dots. At least not yet. A middle-aged man stepped closer to the front of the crowd, squinting hard at Steven's face. His eyes widened. Hold on, guys. I think that's Steven Seagal. People murmured, whispered, leaned forward. Some laughed nervously. A teenage girl zoomed her phone camera toward his face and gasped. Oh my God, it is him. Look at the jawline, the hair, the stance. That's totally him. Another guy added, not just the actor. He's ex-special forces too. My uncle served. He used to talk about him. The officers stiffened. Their expressions changed from irritation to panic. The young cop whispered, That's impossible. He's just some old guy. An old guy who disarmed you without touching you. Someone from the crowd shouted. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, not mocking Steven, but mocking the officers. The lead cop clenched his jaw. His authority was fading fast. Everyone stepped back, he barked, waving his hands. This is an ongoing investigation. Stop recording. But no one stopped. In fact, more phones came out. Steven didn't even look at the crowd. His focus stayed on the officers and on the lifeless body of shadow lying behind them. His voice was low, controlled. You still haven't taken responsibility. The lead cop swallowed. We didn't know he was your dog. Steven stepped forward. You didn't need to know, he said. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't threatening you. He barked once. One time. The officer tried to defend himself. I thought he was dangerous. Steven's eyes turned sharp as a blade. And now you see what real danger looks like. The young cop took a nervous step backward. The crowd reacted instantly. That cop's scared. He's backing away. He knows he messed up. The tension skyrocketed. The officers were no longer in control. Steven was. Still, Steven didn't raise a fist. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. His calmness alone was more terrifying than any aggression. A voice came from the back, an older man, former military by the look of him. That's Delta Force stance, he said firmly. I'd know it anywhere. Someone nearby replied, Delta Force? Are you serious? The older man nodded. He's not just an actor. That man trained with the best of the best. He's a legend in the community. More murmurs spread. And then the moment that changed everything happened. A small boy, maybe 8 years old, pushed his way to the front with his mother. His eyes sparkled as he stared at Steven. Mom, that's the guy from the movies. That's Steven Seagal. His mother nodded softly, tears gathering in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, it is. The officers looked around. Their mistake was becoming public humiliation. The young cop turned pale. He could sue us. He could destroy our careers. The lead cop whispered harshly, "Just stay calm. He can't prove anything." "He doesn't need to," said a voice behind them. Everyone turned. A woman stepped forward, brown hair, a sheriff's department badge visible on her belt. She had been recording the incident the entire time. "I saw everything," she said. "And so did every single camera here." The crowd parted around her like water. "Ma'am," the lead officer stuttered. We're handling the situation." "No," she said. "You mishandled it from the moment you stepped out of your cruiser." The young cop's voice cracked. "Sergeant, Save it," she snapped. "You shot an unarmed, non-aggressive dog. And you escalated a peaceful citizen encounter into a confrontation." Steven finally looked at her. She nodded respectfully. "Mr. Seagal, I'm sorry you had to go through this." The crowd gasped. There it was. Confirmation. Undeniable. Final. Public. Steven Seagal, the deadliest Delta Force commander. The legendary martial artist. The man whose presence alone was enough to shift the ground under these officers' feet. The young cop stammered, "We didn't know." Steven cut him off with a single sentence that silenced everyone. "You didn't need to know who I am, to simply do the right thing." The crowd erupted in applause. Phones captured every second. The officers had nowhere left to hide. The sergeant looked at the lead cop. "You two are done for today. Step back. I'll handle this." The young officer whispered in fear. Are we getting suspended?" The sergeant didn't answer. She didn't need to. Steven crouched down again beside Shadow, his hand shaking slightly as he touched the dog's fur. For the first time, emotion slipped through the iron control he had maintained. Pain, loss, and something deeper, something the officers should have feared more than anything else. A promise. A promise that justice, his justice, was coming. And he never broke a promise. The air felt heavier now. The sergeant stood near Steven, the crowd completely silent, the disgraced officers trembling behind her. But Steven's focus wasn't on them. His eyes were still fixed on Shadow's body. He stroked the dog's fur gently, one last, heartbreaking time, then rose to his full height. Slowly, deliberately, like a storm building strength. The sergeant took a respectful step back. Everyone could sense it. This was the moment Steven Seagal stopped being the quiet man in a cabin and became the commander he once was. His voice, when it finally came, wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was controlled, too controlled. And that made it terrifying. "You took an innocent life today," Steven said, looking directly at the officers who shot Shadow. "And you did it without hesitation, without thought, and without remorse." The young cop stammered, Sir, we didn't mean." Steven raised one finger. Just one. The officer went silent instantly. "You meant everything you did," Steven said. "You meant to intimidate. You meant to use force. You meant to project power you never earned." The crowd murmured in agreement. Steven stepped closer, not aggressively, but with the calculated precision of someone trained to control every inch of his movement. "You wear badges," he continued. "Badges that represent responsibility, accountability, honor. But you threw all of that away the moment you pulled that trigger." The lead cop swallowed. "Please, we didn't know it was your dog. This isn't about who I am." Steven snapped, not screaming, but with a force that felt like a punch to the chest. Everyone froze. Steven's eyes burned into theirs. This is about who he was. The crowd forgot to breathe. Steven pointed at Shadow. "That dog saved more American lives than you ever will. He served with me. He walked into fire. He sniffed out bombs. He stayed calm when bullets were flying past his head." The sergeant looked genuinely shocked. Shadow was a service dog? Steven nodded. He wasn't just a pet. He was a warrior. Gasps rippled across the crowd. The lead officer's legs almost buckled. We didn't know." Steven leaned in, just close enough for the officer to feel the weight of his presence. "You should have known he wasn't a threat," Steven whispered. "You should have known how to control your fear. You should have known how to do your job." The officer trembled visibly. Steven turned away from them and addressed the entire crowd. "This isn't just about my dog," he said. "This is about all of us. About every person who has been mistreated by people who abuse power. About every animal shot because an officer was scared instead of trained. About every citizen who has felt unsafe around the very people meant to protect them." Heads nodded all around. Even the sergeant looked ashamed on behalf of her department. Steven raised his hand slightly. as if presenting a truth the world had forgotten. True strength, he said, isn't in pulling a trigger. It's in control, discipline, respect. He turned his gaze back to the officers. You had none of those today. The young cop was on the verge of tears. We're sorry, truly. Sorry, Steven repeated. My dog is dead, and all you can say is sorry. The officer's voice cracked. What do you want from us? It was a desperate question. Steven stepped forward, his face a mask of calm fury. I want you to take responsibility. The lead cop shook violently. Does that mean you're pressing charges? Steven paused. A long, heavy pause. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then he said, I don't need revenge. I don't need violence. I don't need to break you. The officers exhaled in shaky relief. But, Steven continued, I will make sure this never happens again. The relief vanished. How? The sergeant asked carefully. By exposing it, Steven said. All of it. Every second. Every angle. Every action you took today. His hand pointed to the dozens of phones recording. You thought nobody would see what you did, he said. But now the whole world will. The lead cop looked sick. Please, this will ruin us. Steven nodded slowly. Yes, and maybe it should. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in agreement. People whispered things like, he's right. They deserve consequences. This is justice. Steven took one last look at the officers. You didn't just attack my dog, he said. You attacked the idea of trust. And I will rebuild that trust, not by fighting you. He stepped back, folding his hands behind him like a commander addressing troops. But by holding you accountable. The sergeant stepped forward, her voice firm. Officers, hand over your weapons. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation. The young cop whispered, No, please. But the sergeant didn't waver. Do it. The officers shakily placed their guns on the hood of the cruiser. Steven closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging shadow. Justice had begun, but the world hadn't seen anything yet. This was only the beginning. As the disgraced officers placed their weapons on the hood, the crowd erupted again, this time not in anger, but in an overwhelming wave of relief. People whispered to each other, knowing they had just witnessed something rare. Accountability. Real accountability. The sergeant stepped closer to Steven. I want you to know, she said, we will fully investigate this. I'm personally taking charge. Steven nodded once. Thank you. But even as he spoke politely, the storm inside him grew heavier. His eyes drifted back to Shadow's body, lying still on the gravel road. In that moment, the past returned. Memories of missions, battles, nights when Shadow had saved Steven's life by inches. Shadow wasn't a dog. He was a soldier, a partner, a brother. And now he was gone. The sergeant cleared her throat and gestured to the crowd. Everyone, please step back. Give Mr. Seagal space. But nobody moved. They didn't want space. They wanted justice. They wanted to see what would happen next. A woman in the back yelled, We're with you, Steven. Another shouted, Post the video online. The world needs to see this. The officers' faces turned pale. The young cop whispered to the lead officer, Do you realize what's happening? Once this goes viral, we're done. The lead cop's voice shook. We were just doing our job. No, Steven said, turning his head sharply toward them. What you did wasn't your job. It was fear, panic, lack of training. And now everyone will see it. His voice carried like a blade. Quiet, but sharp enough to cut through every excuse. A teenager held up his phone. It's already up, guys. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts. It's everywhere. The crowd buzzed in excitement. Oh my God, it's blowing up already. There's like 10 angles of the shooting. Hashtag Justice for Shadow is trending. The young cop ran his hands through his hair, trembling now. My career, my life, it's over. Steven's face softened, not with forgiveness, but with grim truth. Actions have consequences, he said, especially when lives are involved. The sergeant stepped between them. Officers, go wait in your vehicle until internal affairs arrives. They obeyed, heads down, steps shaky, faces drained of color. The moment they shut their doors, the sergeant turned to Steven. I want to say something man to man. Steven waited. You handled this with more restraint than most people would, she said. If someone shot my partner, I don't know if I could have stayed as calm as you. Steven exhaled slowly. Calm is something I had to master. Rage doesn't help anyone. Her eyes softened. Shadow must have meant a lot to you. Steven crouched beside his fallen companion again. He followed me into deserts, jungles, mountains. Saved my life more times than I can count. The sergeant lowered her head. I'm sorry. Steven didn't respond. His silence said everything. Suddenly, a second police vehicle arrived, this one with flashing lights. Two higher-ranking officers stepped out, both wearing white shirts and stern expressions. Internal Affairs. The lead investigator walked straight towards Steven, nodding respectfully. Sir, we got calls from half the county before we even arrived. And videos. The sergeant handed over her phone. Everything's recorded. The investigator swiped through the footage, jaw tightening. This is horrible. Completely unacceptable. The young officer inside the cruiser banged the steering wheel in panic. We're dead. We're absolutely done. The investigator signaled the sergeant. Remove their badges. A gasp shot through the crowd. The sergeant walked to the cruiser, opened the door, and held out her hand. Badges. Now. The officers were shaking as they unpinned the metal shields from their uniforms. The young cop cried. The lead cop stared blankly, broken. The entire crowd watched in silence. This was justice. Not violence. Not revenge. Justice. The sergeant returned to Steven, badges in hand. We'll take it from here. You don't have to do anything else. Steven gave a slow nod, but his face remained carved with grief. A little girl stepped forward timidly, holding a small flower. Mr. Seagal, can I give this to your dog? Steven looked at her, eyes softening more than they had all day. He nodded. The girl placed the flower gently on Shadow's body. The crowd went silent. Respectful. Emotional. Then an elderly veteran pushed through, standing tall despite his age. He saluted Steven. Your partner was a hero, he said. And so are you, for protecting him even now. Steven returned the salute, his voice low. Thank you, brother. The older man added, the world's watching this. And they're with you. Steven didn't respond, but the weight of those words hit him hard. Because he knew it was true. From Hollywood fans to veterans to ordinary citizens who loved justice. Everyone was witnessing what happened here. And this was no longer just about Shadow. This was about every abused citizen. Every mistreated animal. Every officer who forgot the meaning of their oath. Steven stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes firm. The world now knew the truth. And once the truth spreads, it cannot be stopped. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the quiet countryside road had transformed into the center of the world. Sirens faded. The officers were escorted away. Internal Affairs sealed the scene. But the real storm, the one online, was just beginning. Within minutes, videos of the incident spread like wildfire. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Justice for Shadow. Hashtag Steven Seagal. Hashtag Police Reform Now. Hashtag Delta Force Legend. Millions watched. Millions shared. Millions reacted with outrage, sadness, and admiration. Steven stood silently beside Shadow's body, surrounded by flickering phone screens capturing every moment. The crowd had grown even bigger. Neighbors, reporters, veterans, animal rights activists. Even off-duty officers from other departments showed up, standing in solidarity. One reporter approached cautiously. Mr. Seagal, the world is watching. Do you have anything you want to say? Steven's eyes lifted slowly. His face was still grief-stricken, but behind the pain was steel, a commander addressing his nation. He stepped forward, and the world listened. I didn't lose a dog today, he began softly. I lost a partner. Cameras flashed. People leaned in. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was a soldier. He served this country with honor. He saved lives, human lives. He fought beside me in places you'll never see on a map. Steven inhaled deeply. And today he died for nothing. The crowd went silent. He didn't attack. He didn't threaten. He barked one time, and fear took his life. Steven pointed toward the police cruiser where the disgraced officers sat. This isn't just about them. It's about a broken system. A system that trains men to shoot before they think. To escalate instead of listen. To use power instead of judgment. People nodded. Others cried. Some clenched their fists. Steven continued, we don't need more violence. We don't need more hate. What we need is accountability. Discipline. Humanity. He looked down at Shadow one last time. Everything I ever taught this dog. Respect, obedience, loyalty. I wish I could say the same about the men who killed him. A wave of emotion rippled through the crowd. Then Steven turned to the cameras. So here is my message to the world. If we want change, we must demand it. Not with fists or weapons, but with truth. With unity. With courage. He placed his hand on Shadow's body. I will make sure Shadow didn't die in vain. I will fight for tougher animal protection laws. I will fight for better training for officers. And I will fight for justice. Not just for him, but for every innocent life lost to fear and negligence. Applause erupted. Huge, heartfelt, overflowing with respect. Reporters shouted questions, but Steven didn't answer. He simply lifted Shadow into his arms. Strong, but gentle, as if carrying a fallen warrior. People stepped aside for him, forming a path. A veteran saluted. A mother wiped her tears. A little girl held up another flower. Steven nodded at her. Thank you, sweetheart. He would have loved that. He walked toward his truck, Shadow held tight against his chest. As he reached the door, a man from the crowd shouted, "We're with you, Steven." Others joined. "Justice for Shadow. We support you. Thank you for your service." Steven placed Shadow carefully in the back seat, then stood tall, silhouetted by the flashing lights behind him. And he delivered his final words like a commander, sending one last message to his troops. Remember this. Power means nothing without compassion, and a badge means nothing without honor. He closed the truck door. The cameras followed him. The world watched. Steven Seagal drove off into the darkness, carrying the body of his loyal companion. But the light he had ignited tonight spread across the globe. Shadow's story would spark change. Steven's words would become a movement. And justice, true justice, had only just begun.